For 5 years, London had remembered the day Charlotte Bennet was left standing alone before an altar. Society remembered failures far longer than kindness. It remembered embarrassment with a devotion that bordered on affection. On a cold February evening in 1864, beneath the glittering chandeliers of Lady Ashcombe's grand ballroom in Mayfair, Charlotte discovered that some wounds never truly vanished. They merely learned how to wear silk gloves and smile politely. Music drifted through the crowded room as couples moved across the polished floor in elegant patterns. Crystal reflected candlelight from every direction. Diamonds flashed at throats and wrists. The air smelled faintly of roses, beeswax, and expensive perfume. Everywhere she looked, young women laughed behind painted fans while ambitious mothers calculated futures with military precision. Charlotte stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the snow-covered garden, far enough from the center of attention to avoid unwanted conversation, yet close enough to observe the room. It was a position she had perfected over the years. At 27, she had become remarkably skilled at being present without truly belonging. "There she is," a woman whispered nearby. Charlotte did not turn her head. Experience had taught her that pretending not to hear was often the kindest thing one could do for everyone involved. "Who?" another woman asked. "Miss Bennet." The first speaker lowered her voice, though not enough. "The one who was abandoned at St. Matthew's Chapel." Charlotte continued gazing through the window. Outside, snow drifted softly across the garden paths. "Good heavens," the second woman murmured. "That was years ago. People do not forget such things." No, they did not. Society had many talents. Forgiveness was rarely among them. Charlotte lifted her teacup and took a careful sip. Her expression remained composed. Anyone watching would have assumed she had heard nothing at all. That assumption would have been incorrect. Every word reached her with perfect clarity. It simply no longer had the power to destroy her. 5 years earlier, she might have returned home in tears. 3 years earlier, she might have hidden in the ladies' retiring room until the humiliation passed. Tonight, she merely watched the snow. Growth often looked remarkably boring from the outside. "Charlotte!" The familiar voice drew her attention away from the window. She turned to find Lady Margaret Whitmore approaching through the crowd. At 53, Margaret possessed the rare gift of honesty wrapped in kindness. Her silver hair was elegantly arranged beneath a sapphire headpiece that matched her gown. "You look beautiful tonight." Charlotte smiled warmly. "You say that every time you see me." "Because it remains true every time I see you." Margaret linked her arm through Charlotte's. "Although I admit your dressmaker deserves some credit." Charlotte glanced down at the deep blue silk gown she wore. It was simple compared to many of the elaborate creations surrounding her. The color complemented her gray eyes and dark brown hair. More importantly, it allowed her to breathe comfortably through an entire evening. Experience had taught her that elegance and suffering did not need to be close acquaintances. "You are kind," Charlotte said. "I am observant." Margaret studied her carefully. "And you are pretending those women near the orchestra are not discussing you." Charlotte laughed softly. "There are at least 3 groups discussing me." 4. "Only 4? My reputation must be improving." Margaret shook her head, though amusement flickered in her eyes. "How do you manage it?" "Manage what?" "Not caring." Charlotte considered the question. She had been asked versions of it many times. Usually by women who mistook composure for immunity. "I do care," she said quietly. "I simply decided several years ago that other people's opinion should not be allowed to determine the quality of my life." Margaret's expression softened. "That sounds very wise." "It sounds very expensive." Wisdom usually arrives after considerable emotional cost. The older woman squeezed her hand affectionately. "One day some gentleman will recognize exactly what kind of woman you are." Charlotte glanced around the ballroom. "If that gentleman exists, he appears to be running quite late." Margaret laughed. Before she could reply, a sudden shift moved through the room like a ripple across still water. Conversations faltered. Heads turned toward the entrance. The orchestra continued playing, but even the musicians seemed distracted. Charlotte recognized the pattern immediately. Only one person in London could produce that particular reaction without speaking a single word. The Duke of Ravenshire had arrived. Margaret sighed dramatically. And there goes every unmarried woman under 30. Charlotte followed the direction of everyone's attention. Alexander Sterling stood near the entrance, acknowledging greetings with brief nods. At 34, he possessed the kind of presence that could not be ignored even by people who wished to ignore it. Tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed, and entirely aware of the effect he had on a room. Dark hair. Grey eyes. An expression suggesting that most of humanity existed primarily to interrupt more important thoughts. Charlotte had seen him many times over the years. Their social circles overlapped enough to make complete avoidance impossible. They had never been formally introduced. He had never given her a reason to remember him beyond his title. She certainly had not given him one. Half the mothers in London are currently calculating wedding dates, Margaret observed. Only half. Charlotte asked. The ambitious half. The realistic half know they have no chance. Across the ballroom, Alexander exchanged a few words with Lord Ashcombe before moving deeper into the crowd. Women seemed to appear naturally in his path. He navigated around them with practiced courtesy and complete indifference. Charlotte found the spectacle mildly entertaining. It reminded her of ducks attempting to attract a swan that had no interest in ponds. You are smiling. Margaret sounded suspicious. I am observing human nature. That never ends well. Charlotte took another sip of tea. Neither does marriage, judging by many examples in this room. Margaret gasped dramatically. Charlotte Bennet, are you becoming cynical? No. Merely experienced. The older woman shook her head. You hide behind wit whenever anyone attempts to discuss your future. Charlotte's smile faded slightly. My future is quite straightforward. Is it? I manage my household. I support my charitable work. I attend enough social functions to prevent my aunt from staging an intervention. It is a peaceful arrangement. Margaret studied her face for a long moment. And if you met someone worthy? Charlotte looked away. Beyond the ballroom windows, snow continued falling through the darkness. Soft. Silent. Unconcerned with society's expectations. Then I suppose he would need to be exceptionally patient. Before Margaret could pursue the subject, another guest approached. The interruption was welcome. Charlotte spent the next half hour moving through polite conversations about weather, charity events, and the upcoming season. She smiled when required. Listened attentively. Contributed just enough to avoid appearing rude. It was a performance she had mastered long ago. Yet throughout the evening, she remained aware of the familiar undercurrent beneath every interaction. Pity. Curiosity. Speculation. Some people looked at her and saw a woman. Others saw a cautionary tale. Near the refreshment table, she overheard a young debutante whisper, "Is that really her?" Her companion nodded. My mother says she was meant to marry a viscount. What happened? He married someone else. Charlotte continued walking. There was no anger left in such moments. Only a faint sadness for people who found entertainment in old heartbreaks. The truth was far less dramatic than society preferred. 5 years earlier, she had loved a man. He had loved someone else. Painful. Embarrassing. Human. Yet London had transformed it into legend. Tragedy always sold better than reality. She eventually found refuge near a bookshelf in one of the adjoining drawing rooms. The noise was softer there. The crowd thinner. For several precious minutes, she enjoyed something close to peace. Then she heard her name. Not whispered this time. Spoken clearly. Deliberately. Charlotte paused. The voices came from the opposite side of the partially open doorway. A group of aristocratic women stood nearby, unaware of her presence. What about Miss Bennet? One woman suggested. Another laughed. For whom? The Duke of Ravenshire. The laughter grew louder. Surely you jest. Charlotte remained perfectly still. Why not? The first woman persisted. She is respectable, attractive, intelligent, and entirely unsuitable. Because of the old scandal. Because he is the Duke of Ravenshire. The woman sounded astonished. A duke does not marry a woman everyone remembers being abandoned. Charlotte lowered her gaze briefly. The word should not have hurt. Yet some injuries retained echoes long after healing. The conversation continued. More speculation. More assumptions. Then another voice joined the group. Male. Calm. Deep. Instantly recognizable. Charlotte felt something tighten in her chest. Alexander Sterling. She could not see him from her position. Only hear him. Your Grace, one of the women said brightly. We were discussing potential brides for you. A pause followed. An exhausting topic. Several people laughed. Then perhaps we have solved it. Have you? Miss Charlotte Bennet. Silence lingered. Long enough for curiosity to sharpen. Long enough for Charlotte's pulse to slow unexpectedly. She did not know why she remained where she was. She could have walked away. She probably should have. Instead, she waited. Somewhere beyond the doorway, Alexander Sterling considered the suggestion. And in that suspended moment, neither he nor anyone else realized that the woman under discussion stood only a few feet away. Listening. Unseen. As she had been for years. The evening was about to change. Neither of them knew it yet. But the first crack had already appeared. The pause lasted only a few seconds. It felt considerably longer. Charlotte remained motionless beside the bookshelf, one hand resting lightly against the spine of a leather-bound volume she had no intention of reading. Beyond the doorway, the small group waited for the Duke's response with the eager anticipation of people who enjoyed discussing other lives more than managing their own. Miss Bennet. Alexander finally repeated. His tone revealed nothing. Yes. The woman who had suggested Charlotte sounded encouraged. Surely she possesses every quality one might seek in a wife. A brief silence followed. Then another female voice joined the conversation. Charlotte recognized it immediately. Lady Caroline Graves. Beautiful. Wealthy. Ambitious. Widely considered one of the most likely candidates to become a duchess. Miss Bennet is certainly respectable, Caroline said smoothly. But let us be honest. Ravenshire could choose from almost any woman in England. Several ladies murmured agreement. That is hardly an answer. Alexander sounded mildly amused. Then allow me to be more direct. Caroline's voice softened with false sympathy. Miss Bennet is pleasant enough. Yet society remembers certain things. Some women recover from public disappointment. Others become defined by it. Charlotte felt the familiar sting of old humiliation. Not because Caroline's words contained truth. Because they contained cruelty disguised as truth. That particular form of malice was always the most dangerous. Another woman laughed quietly. You cannot possibly imagine the Duke pursuing someone with such history. I cannot, Caroline agreed. A moment later, someone asked the question that would alter the course of several lives. What do you think, Your Grace? The room seemed to grow quieter. Even from her position behind the doorway, Charlotte could sense everyone's attention settling upon Alexander Sterling. Waiting. Expecting. Hoping for entertainment. When he spoke, his voice remained calm. Almost casual. Miss Bennet is beneath me. The words landed with astonishing precision. Not shouted. Not cruelly delivered. Merely stated as though he were discussing weather or property values. Perhaps that was what made them worse. For a moment, no one spoke. Then soft laughter spread through the group. Polite laughter. Comfortable laughter. The kind produced when a powerful man confirms what everyone already believes. Charlotte stared at the bookshelf before her. Her heartbeat remained steady. The strange thing was that she did not feel shocked, nor devastated, nor even particularly wounded. 5 years earlier, such a remark might have shattered her. Tonight, she experienced something entirely different. Clarity. The irony was almost amusing. For years she had watched society treat rank as proof of character, wealth as proof of wisdom, power as proof of worth. Now one of the most admired men in England had revealed himself with a single sentence. Not as a villain. Simply as a man who believed status determined value. The realization felt unexpectedly freeing. Behind the doorway, the conversation continued. Someone made another joke. More laughter followed. Charlotte smiled. Then she laughed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough for the sound to carry across the small drawing room. The conversation stopped immediately. Silence rushed into the space where laughter had existed only seconds before. Charlotte stepped away from the bookshelf and walked toward the doorway. Several faces turned pale as she emerged. Others widened with horror. Lady Caroline Graves looked as though she had swallowed ice. Alexander Sterling stood among them, tall and composed in his black evening coat. For the first time that evening, their eyes met. Grey against grey. The room waited. Charlotte could almost hear people holding their breath. They expected tears. Outrage. Embarrassment. A dramatic scene suitable for future gossip. Instead, she smiled. Your Grace. She offered a perfectly correct curtsy. Nothing more. Nothing less. For a brief second, something shifted in Alexander's expression. Surprise, perhaps. He clearly had not expected her presence. Miss Bennet. His voice remained controlled. Charlotte straightened. The silence grew almost unbearable for everyone except her. Lady Caroline recovered first. Charlotte, she said quickly. We had no idea you were standing there. Clearly. Charlotte's smile widened slightly. A few nervous chuckles escaped from the surrounding guests. Nobody knew what to do. Nobody knew which side of the situation was safe. Charlotte looked directly at Alexander. You need not concern yourself, Your Grace. Another pause. I assure you, the feeling is entirely mutual. For the first time since entering the ballroom, the Duke appeared genuinely caught off guard. It lasted only a moment. Most people would not have noticed. Charlotte did. Then she laughed again. Softly. Warmly. As though the entire matter amused her rather than injured her. Which, at that point, it did. Good evening. She turned and walked away. No dramatic exit. No hurried retreat. No visible distress. She simply left the group standing in stunned silence and crossed the ballroom toward the main staircase. Behind her, conversation remained frozen. Even the orchestra seemed quieter. Halfway across the room, she heard Margaret Whitmore call her name. Charlotte slowed but did not stop. Margaret quickly caught up with her. Charlotte. The older woman looked horrified. My dear, are you all right? Perfectly. Perfectly. Margaret stared at her. The man just insulted you in front of half of London. Only half. Charlotte asked. Attendance must be lower than usual. Margaret groaned. This is not the time for humor. On the contrary. It is exactly the time for humor. They reached the cloakroom. A footman hurried forward to retrieve Charlotte's wrap. Margaret followed closely behind. You are leaving. I have suddenly remembered several more pleasant ways to spend my evening. Such as? Charlotte accepted her cloak. Reading. Sleeping. Organizing household accounts. Watching paint dry. Despite herself, Margaret laughed. Then concern returned. You should not have had to endure that. Charlotte fastened her gloves. No. But I did endure it. She paused. which is rather the important distinction. Margaret's eye softened. You are stronger than I was at your age. Charlotte looked toward the ballroom entrance. Music still floated through the house. Laughter had gradually resumed. Society never remained uncomfortable for long. No, she said quietly. I am simply tired of allowing other people to decide whether I deserve happiness. The older woman embraced her briefly. Promise you will send for me tomorrow. I promise. A few minutes later, Charlotte stepped into the cold London night. Snowflakes drifted beneath the glow of gas lamps. Carriages lined the street. Horses stamped their hooves against the frozen pavement. The sharp winter air filled her lungs. She felt lighter than she had in weeks. Behind her, inside the mansion, a scandal was already taking shape. She could almost hear it forming. By morning, every drawing room in Mayfair would know exactly what had happened. The Duke of Ravenshire had declared Miss Charlotte Bennet beneath him. Miss Charlotte Bennet had laughed in his face and walked away. The second half of that story interested society far more than the first. Charlotte climbed into her carriage and settled against the seat as the vehicle began moving through the snowy streets. She closed her eyes. The evening was finished. Alexander Sterling would disappear from her thoughts by breakfast. At least, that was what she believed. Inside Lady Ashcombe's ballroom, however, Alexander remained exactly where she had left him. Several guests attempted to restart the conversation. None succeeded. Lady Caroline finally broke the silence. Well? Her smile looked strained. That was awkward. Nobody responded. Alexander's gaze remained fixed upon the doorway through which Charlotte had disappeared. He replayed the encounter in his mind. Not her words. Those had been brief enough. Not her departure. What troubled him was the laughter. He had expected anger. Embarrassment. Hurt. Perhaps even tears. Instead, she had looked at him as though his opinion carried no more weight than a passing comment from a stranger. As though he were entirely irrelevant. It was an unfamiliar sensation. Unpleasantly unfamiliar. Your Grace? Caroline prompted gently. Alexander blinked. Forgive me. You seem distracted. Do I? A little. He glanced toward her. Caroline offered a carefully practiced smile. Beautiful. Polished. Predictable. For reasons he could not explain, he suddenly found the expression exhausting. Across the ballroom, guests had already resumed dancing. Yet fragments of conversation drifted through the room. Whispers. Speculation. Curiosity. All centered upon one woman who was no longer present. Alexander looked toward the entrance again. Strange. He had spent years ignoring countless women eager for his attention. Tonight, the only one who interested him was the one who had walked away. And for the first time in a very long time, Alexander Sterling found himself wondering whether he had made a mistake. Alexander Sterling had built his reputation upon certainty. For more than a decade, he had moved through London's highest circles with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being right. His decisions expanded estates, settled disputes, and strengthened alliances. His judgment was trusted in Parliament, respected in business, and rarely questioned anywhere society gathered. Yet 3 days after Lady Ashcombe's ball, he found himself standing beside the window of his study at Ravenshire House, staring at a report he had read for times without absorbing a single word. Snow still covered the rooftops beyond the glass. The city stretched beneath a grey winter sky. Carriages moved through the streets below. Chimneys released pale smoke into the cold air. None of it held his attention. His thoughts kept returning to the same moment. The same woman. The same laugh. He folded the report and set it aside. The sound of the study door opening drew his attention. Nathaniel Mercer entered carrying a stack of correspondence. At 36, Nathaniel had served as Alexander's closest friend and estate solicitor for nearly a decade. Unlike most people, he possessed no fear of disagreeing with a duke. "You are staring at that window again," Nathaniel observed. It has become one of your more concerning hobbies. Alexander turned away from the glass. Have you come to discuss estate matters or critique my behavior? Both. Nathaniel placed the letters on the desk. The tenants in Hampshire require approval for a drainage project. He paused. And you have spent the last 3 days behaving like a man who misplaced something valuable. I have misplaced nothing. Nathaniel sat comfortably in the chair opposite the desk. Then why do you keep looking as though someone insulted you? Alexander considered denying it. The attempt seemed pointless. No one insulted me. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. That is not a denial. Silence stretched between them. Finally Alexander exhaled. Do you know Charlotte Bennet? Nathaniel blinked. That is not the direction I expected this conversation to take. Do you know her? Slightly. Nathaniel leaned back. Why? Alexander walked toward the fireplace. Flames crackled softly behind the protective screen. I encountered her at Lady Ashcombe's gathering. So I heard. The solicitor's expression became suspiciously interested. London appears quite fascinated by the event. Alexander frowned. People exaggerate. Do they? Nathaniel looked amused. According to the version I heard, an entire ballroom witnessed the first woman in England completely unimpressed by the Duke of Ravenshire. Nonsense. Perhaps. Yet the story grows more entertaining every time it is repeated. Alexander stared into the fire. He disliked how accurately the rumors reflected reality. Tell me about her. Nathaniel's amusement faded. Miss Bennet. Yes. Why? Alexander searched for an acceptable answer. None appeared. Curiosity. Nathaniel laughed outright. That is even worse. Must everything become a source of entertainment for you? When you begin asking questions about women, absolutely. The Duke ignored the comment. What do you know? Nathaniel studied him for a moment before answering. Her father was Viscount Bennet. A decent man by most accounts. He died several years ago. Alexander nodded. Most of that information sounded familiar. And? She lived with her aunt in Mayfair. Manages the household finances herself. Supports several charitable projects. Such as? Nathaniel appeared mildly surprised by the question. A school in Whitechapel. A literacy program for working women. Funding for a small clinic near Westminster. Alexander looked up. She manages all of that. Apparently. Why have I never heard about it? Nathaniel smiled faintly. Because she does not spend her evenings announcing her virtues to strangers. The answer irritated him for reasons he could not explain. During the following hour, Alexander attempted to focus on estate business. He reviewed contracts. Approved expenditures. Responded to correspondence. Yet his concentration remained fragmented. Every time his mind drifted, it returned to Charlotte Bennet. Not the scandal from 5 years earlier. Not society's version of her. The actual woman. Intelligent eyes. Controlled composure. That laugh. Particularly the laugh. Most people sought approval from powerful men. Charlotte Bennet had treated his approval as entirely irrelevant. It should not have mattered. Yet somehow it did. By Thursday afternoon, the matter had become impossible to ignore. Alexander left a meeting earlier than usual and instructed his carriage driver to take a longer route through the city. He told himself he needed fresh air. The explanation convinced no one, including himself. The carriage rolled through busy streets lined with shops and townhouses. London bustled despite the winter weather. Vendors called to customers. Children darted between pedestrians. Workers hurried through the cold carrying parcels and crates. Alexander watched absent-mindedly through the window. Then something unexpected caught his attention. Stop. The carriage halted immediately. Alexander leaned forward. Across the street stood a modest brick building he vaguely recognized. Several women emerged from the entrance carrying books. Others entered through the front door. Above the entrance hung a simple sign: Bennett Women's Reading Society. His gaze narrowed. Surely not. He opened the carriage door and stepped onto the sidewalk. The cold air struck his face. A few pedestrians recognized him and offered respectful greetings. Alexander barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the building. Moments later, the front door opened again. Charlotte Bennett stepped outside. She wore a dark green cloak trimmed with simple fur. Snowflakes rested lightly upon her hair. For an instant, Alexander simply watched. There was something different about her here. Something lighter. The guarded distance she carried through society seemed absent. A young woman emerged behind her carrying several books. "Miss Bennett?" the girl asked. Charlotte smiled. A genuine smile. Warm and effortless. "You have finished all 3 already. I stayed up late reading. Then I shall need to find something more challenging for you." The young woman laughed. "My brother says I read too much. Your brother should develop better habits." Another woman approached carrying a basket. Charlotte greeted her by name. Then another. And another. Each interaction felt natural. Comfortable. Familiar. These people knew her. Not as a cautionary tale. Not as a failed bride. Simply as Charlotte. Alexander remained where he stood, strangely unwilling to leave. After several minutes, Charlotte finally turned in his direction. Her eyes widened slightly when she recognized him across the street. Not dramatically. Just enough to reveal surprise. They looked at each other for a brief moment. Then Charlotte inclined her head politely. Nothing more. No embarrassment. No anger. No effort to attract attention. She simply acknowledged his existence and returned to her conversation. Alexander found himself oddly disappointed. He had no idea why. A coach passed between them. By the time it moved on, Charlotte had disappeared back inside the building. The door closed behind her. The street returned to normal. Yet Alexander remained standing in the cold several seconds longer than necessary. "Your Grace," his driver called cautiously. Alexander blinked. "Yes. Shall we continue?" He glanced toward the Reading Society one final time. "Yes." The carriage resumed its journey. That evening, however, the image remained with him. Not the ballroom. Not the scandal. A different image entirely. Charlotte standing among ordinary people. Smiling. Teaching. Listening. The version of her society never discussed. 2 days later, another opportunity presented itself. Lord Pembroke hosted a luncheon attended by several members of Parliament and their families. Alexander accepted the invitation primarily because refusing would create unnecessary questions. Upon arrival, he immediately regretted the decision. The conversation revolved around politics, trade routes, and marriage prospects. Most of it was painfully predictable. Then he noticed Charlotte seated at the far end of the dining room beside an elderly countess. She appeared completely absorbed in conversation. The countess laughed repeatedly throughout the meal. Charlotte seemed equally entertained. Curious, Alexander observed discreetly from across the table. At one point the countess dropped her napkin. Before any servant could react, Charlotte retrieved it and handed it back with a smile. A small gesture. Yet somehow revealing. Throughout the luncheon, Charlotte paid more attention to others than herself. She listened carefully. Asked thoughtful questions. Remembered details people mentioned. By the end of the meal, 3 separate guests appeared delighted by her company. Alexander found himself comparing those interactions to the women who usually pursued him. The comparison proved unexpectedly unfavorable. Later, as guests gathered in the drawing room, he overheard 2 gentlemen discussing her. "Remarkable woman," one said. "Who?" asked the other. "Miss Bennett." "Really?" She helped my niece obtain a teaching position after her father died. Never asked for recognition. Alexander slowed his pace. The second gentleman nodded. I have heard similar stories. Most people have. They simply do not connect them to her. The conversation continued. Alexander listened without meaning to. Piece by piece, a different portrait emerged. One entirely separate from society's gossip. By the time he returned home that evening, a disturbing realization had taken root. He had been wrong. Not about a minor detail. Not about some insignificant social misunderstanding. Fundamentally wrong. Worse still, he had been wrong publicly. The thought should have annoyed him. Instead it produced something far more uncomfortable. Regret. Deep within Ravenshire House, Alexander sat alone in his study long after midnight. The fire had burned low. The city beyond his windows slept beneath fresh snow. Yet he remained awake. Thinking. Remembering. Re-examining every assumption he had made. Somewhere in London, Charlotte Bennet was likely sleeping peacefully. Unaware that the man who had dismissed her so casually could no longer stop thinking about her. And for the first time since their encounter, Alexander found himself asking a question that refused to leave him. If society had been wrong about Charlotte Bennet all these years, what else had he failed to see? The question followed Alexander Sterling through the next week like a shadow he could neither outrun nor ignore. Every answer seemed to lead to 3 more questions. Every casual inquiry uncovered another detail society had somehow overlooked. By the second week of March, the mystery no longer centered on what Charlotte Bennet had endured 5 years earlier. It centered on who she had become afterward. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Alexander sat in a private office at the Westminster Charitable Commission reviewing estate reports when Lord Pembroke entered unexpectedly. "You are working too much," Pembroke announced. That is an accusation frequently made by people who do not manage 6 counties. And yet somehow they survive. Alexander barely glanced up. "What do you need?" "Your signature on the education funding proposal." Pembroke placed several documents on the desk. The Reading Society submitted another expansion request. That caught Alexander's attention immediately. The Bennet Society. Pembroke blinked. "You know about it." "A little." "Then you already know they accomplish twice as much with half the funding of most organizations." Pembroke settled into a chair. "Miss Bennet runs it remarkably well." Alexander opened the proposal. Several pages detailed financial records, attendance numbers, and future plans. Everything appeared meticulously organized. The signatures at the bottom included local officials, clergy members, and several respected businessmen. All endorsed the project enthusiastically. "How long has she been involved?" Alexander asked. "Since the beginning. And nobody mentions it." Pembroke laughed. "People mention it constantly. You simply spend your time with aristocrats. They rarely notice anything beyond their own social calendars." Alexander continued reading. The figures were impressive. More impressive was the consistency. Year after year the organization expanded. Enrollment increased. Costs remained controlled. Donations were accounted for down to the smallest expense. Who handles the finances? Miss Bennet. Personally. Every penny. Pembroke smiled. You sound surprised. Alexander was surprised. Most charitable committees delegated such responsibilities. Charlotte apparently did not. Interesting. Very. Pembroke leaned forward. You know what interests me. I suspect you are going to tell me. The fact that half of London views her as a tragic spinster while she quietly accomplishes more than most titled gentlemen. Alexander said nothing. The observation struck closer to the truth than he cared to admit. That evening another piece of the puzzle appeared unexpectedly. Ravenshire House hosted a small dinner attended by several influential families. The gathering remained formal but pleasant. Politics, business, and upcoming social events dominated conversation. Alexander participated automatically. Years of experience allowed him to appear attentive while thinking about entirely different matters. Dessert had just been served when Lady Margaret Whitmore mentioned Charlotte's name. "I saw her yesterday," Margaret said. "Where?" asked one of the guests. "The clinic near Westminster." "Was she visiting someone?" "No. She was organizing supplies." Alexander looked up immediately. Margaret noticed. A knowing expression appeared briefly in her eyes. "The clinic?" another guest asked. "Miss Bennet helped support it." Margaret stirred her tea. "She has for years." "I had no idea." "Few people do." Alexander listened carefully as the conversation continued. More stories emerged. Donations quietly provided. Families assisted during difficult times. Employment opportunities arranged without public recognition. None of it matched the woman society preferred discussing. By the end of the evening, Alexander felt increasingly unsettled. Not because Charlotte possessed admirable qualities. Many people possessed admirable qualities. What troubled him was how completely his original judgment had failed. He had dismissed her without knowing anything meaningful about her at all. 3 days later, curiosity overcame pride. Alexander visited the Westminster Clinic personally. Officially, he was inspecting charitable initiatives receiving estate contributions. The explanation sounded reasonable enough. Unfortunately, he knew it was not entirely true. The clinic occupied a modest building near a busy intersection. Patients arrived steadily despite the cold weather. Nurses moved efficiently through crowded hallways. The atmosphere felt practical rather than elegant. Alexander entered quietly. No one paid particular attention to him at first. Then a physician recognized him and hurried forward. "Your Grace." "Doctor." Alexander shook the man's hand. "I hope I am not interrupting." "Not at all." The physician smiled. "We are grateful for your support." Alexander glanced around. "I understand Miss Bennet is involved here." The doctor's face brightened immediately. "Very much so." "In what capacity?" "Nearly every capacity." The physician laughed softly. "Fundraising. Organization. Supplies. Education. She somehow manages all of it." Alexander followed him down a corridor. Several rooms opened on either side. Patients rested quietly while staff attended them. Nothing extravagant. Nothing dramatic. Just people helping other people. "Does she receive compensation?" Alexander asked. "None." The doctor stopped beside an office. "She arrives 3 days each week regardless of weather." "Why?" The physician looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Because she cares." Such a simple answer. Yet somehow difficult to dismiss. Voices drifted from the next room. One belonged to Charlotte. Alexander recognized it instantly. The doctor smiled. "She is here today." Before Alexander could respond, Charlotte emerged carrying a stack of notebooks. She stopped abruptly upon seeing him. Surprise flashed across her features. Then composure returned. "Your Grace." "Miss Bennet." A brief silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Merely unexpected. Charlotte glanced toward the physician. "I did not realize we were receiving distinguished visitors." "Neither did I," Alexander admitted. The physician wisely excused himself moments later, leaving them alone in the corridor. Charlotte shifted the notebook slightly. "May I assist you with something?" "Perhaps." Alexander searched for the right words. Finding them proved unexpectedly difficult. "I was unaware of your involvement here." "Many people are." Her tone remained polite but carried unmistakable meaning. Alexander deserved that. "Apparently." Charlotte studied him carefully. "Is there a reason you came?" A direct question. "Fair." "Unavoidable." "I wish to learn more about the clinic." "And?" "I have learned that its success depends considerably upon you." For a second, genuine discomfort crossed her face. The success depends upon dozens of people. You are avoiding credit. I am assigning it accurately. Alexander found himself almost smiling. You dislike praise. I dislike unnecessary attention. Her answer arrived too quickly to be rehearsed. It sounded honest. That alone made it unusual within their social world. Nearby, a young boy raced through the corridor before a nurse gently redirected him. Charlotte immediately knelt to speak with him. Her expression softened. Her voice became warmer. Encouraging. Patient. The child smiled and hurried away. Alexander watched the interaction carefully. Once again he witnessed the same version of Charlotte he had seen at the reading society. The version hidden from ballroom gossip. She rose smoothly. Children rarely appreciate rules. Neither do adults. Charlotte laughed. The sound caught him off guard. Not because it was unfamiliar. Because it reminded him of another laugh. One that had haunted him for weeks. For a moment neither spoke. Then Charlotte glanced toward a clock on the wall. I should return to work. Of course. She nodded politely. Good afternoon, Your Grace. Miss Bennet. Charlotte disappeared down the corridor carrying her notebooks. Alexander remained where he stood several moments longer. The encounter had been brief. Yet somehow it deepened rather than resolved his curiosity. Later that afternoon he found himself walking through the clinic gardens before returning home. The physician joined him. Remarkable woman, the doctor said casually. Alexander did not pretend to misunderstand. So I have heard. She helped establish this place after her father's death. The physician paused. Most people would have withdrawn from society after what happened to her. Alexander looked toward the building. Yet she did not. No. The doctor smiled faintly. She chose usefulness instead. The word stayed with Alexander long after he left. Usefulness instead. While society discussed humiliation, Charlotte had quietly built something meaningful. While people remembered her worst day, she had spent years improving the lives of others. By the time Alexander returned to Ravenshire House that evening, he felt something dangerous beginning to emerge. Respect. Real respect. Not the superficial admiration granted to beauty or charm. Something deeper. Something earned. That realization alone would have been unsettling enough. Unfortunately, another development arrived before the week ended. During a dinner hosted by the Graves family, Alexander overheard Lady Caroline speaking with several guests. Poor Charlotte, Caroline said sympathetically. I do hope she has accepted reality by now. What do you mean? Asked a young lady. Caroline lowered her voice. She has always struggled to let go of impossible ambitions. Such as certain gentlemen beyond her reach. The implication was obvious. Deliberate. Cruel. Several guests exchanged knowing looks. Alexander felt his jaw tighten. Until that moment, he had assumed Caroline merely enjoyed gossip. Now he recognized something else beneath the polished manners. Intent. She was shaping a narrative. Guiding opinion. Turning Charlotte into the subject of ridicule once again. Caroline noticed him standing nearby and smiled brightly. Your Grace. Alexander returned the greeting automatically. Yet for the rest of the evening, her words lingered unpleasantly in his mind. Because for the first time, he saw the danger clearly. Society was preparing to rewrite Charlotte's story. Again. And somewhere beneath the growing irritation, another realization began taking shape. He no longer wanted to stand aside and watch it happen. By early April, London had decided it understood Charlotte Bennet. The city was wrong. Unfortunately, being wrong had never prevented society from reaching conclusions. Spring arrived slowly that year. The last traces of winter lingered in shaded corners of gardens and along stone walls. The social season, however, moved forward with its usual energy. Invitations multiplied. Ballrooms reopened. drawing rooms filled with speculation, ambition, and carefully disguised competition. Charlotte navigated it all with the calm patience of someone who had long ago accepted that public opinion behaved much like weather. It changed constantly and rarely listened to reason. On a bright Thursday morning, she sat in the Reading Society's office reviewing expense ledgers while sunlight filtered through tall windows. Several volunteers organized books nearby. The atmosphere felt peaceful, productive, familiar. A welcome contrast to the exhausting performance required by fashionable society. You should not ignore it. Charlotte glanced up from the ledger. Margaret Whitmore stood in the doorway holding a folded newspaper. Concern was written plainly across her face. Charlotte immediately recognized that expression. What happened? Margaret entered the office and placed the newspaper on the desk. It has begun. Charlotte lowered her eyes to the page. The article itself discussed an upcoming charity gala. Nothing unusual. Yet a short paragraph near the bottom referenced recent speculation surrounding one of London's most eligible dukes and a certain unmarried lady whose interest allegedly exceeded propriety. Charlotte read the passage twice. Then she sighed. Creative. Cruel. Margaret pulled out a chair. And completely false. That has never discouraged anyone before. Charlotte folded the paper and set it aside. Who started it? Margaret hesitated. That answer alone was revealing. Caroline Graves. Charlotte had expected as much. Of course. She has been planting suggestions everywhere. Margaret's voice sharpened with irritation. Never direct accusations. Never anything obvious. Just enough comments to guide conversations. Charlotte leaned back in her chair. For a few moments she said nothing. The office remained quiet except for pages turning in the next room. Finally she smiled faintly. Then she is working harder than I am. Margaret stared at her. That is your response. What would you prefer? Anger. I tried anger years ago. It was exhausting. Margaret groaned softly. One day your patience will drive me to drink. Charlotte laughed. Yet after Margaret departed, the article lingered in her thoughts longer than she wished to admit. Not because the rumors threatened her reputation. That reputation had survived far worse. What troubled her was the intention behind them. Someone wanted society to believe she pursued Alexander Sterling. Someone wanted every interaction, every coincidence, every shared room interpreted through that lens. It was a familiar strategy. Humiliation wrapped in elegance. Several days later, Charlotte experienced the first consequences directly. Lady Winthrop hosted an afternoon gathering attended by many of London's most influential women. The event centered upon charitable fundraising. Officially. Unofficially, it functioned as an exchange market for gossip. Charlotte arrived with modest expectations and was immediately proven correct. She had barely entered the drawing room before conversations began shifting around her. Smiles lingered slightly too long. Questions carried hidden meanings. Even compliments felt carefully constructed. Charlotte. Lady Winthrop greeted her warmly. How lovely to see you. Thank you for inviting me. Of course. The older woman hesitated. I hope you are not allowing recent nonsense to trouble you. Charlotte nearly laughed. The fact that people now referred to the rumors as recent nonsense suggested they had spread remarkably fast. Not at all. Good. Lady Winthrop squeezed her hand. Because sensible people know better. Unfortunately, sensible people represented only a small percentage of society. Throughout the afternoon, Charlotte endured a steady stream of veiled comments. Some subtle. Others embarrassingly transparent. You must attend Lord Ashford's ball next week, one woman said. I hear the Duke of Ravenshire plans to attend. Another smiled knowingly. What a fortunate coincidence. Later, someone remarked, perhaps this season will prove more successful than previous ones. The implication required no explanation. Charlotte responded with grace. Always polite. Always composed. Yet each comment landed like a tiny stone. Harmless individually, exhausting collectively. By the end of the gathering, she felt unusually tired. Not wounded. Simply tired. Across town, Alexander encountered the same rumors from an entirely different perspective. He first noticed them during a luncheon at Whitehall. Several gentlemen discussed marriage prospects while waiting for dessert. The conversation drifted naturally toward prominent families and eligible women. Then someone mentioned Charlotte. Persistent woman, one gentleman remarked. Who? Alexander asked before he could stop himself. Miss Bennet. The man chuckled. Apparently she has set her sights rather high. Silence settled briefly around the table. Alexander's expression hardened. I beg your pardon. The gentleman looked startled. The rumors, Your Grace. Surely you have heard them. I have heard many rumors. His voice remained calm. That made it considerably more intimidating. Most prove inaccurate. An uncomfortable pause followed. The subject changed quickly. Yet Alexander's irritation remained long after the meal ended. Because he knew exactly where such gossip led. He had watched society destroy reputations through repetition alone. A lie spoken often enough eventually acquired the appearance of truth. Later that evening, Nathaniel Mercer found him pacing the study at Ravenshire House. You are wearing a path into the carpet. Alexander ignored the observation. How widespread are the rumors? Nathaniel sighed. More widespread than they were last week. And? Less widespread than they will be next week if no one stops them. Alexander stopped pacing. Who started them? Caroline Graves. You are certain? Nathaniel nodded. As certain as one can be regarding something she never says directly. Alexander moved toward the window. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. London glimmered beneath scattered gas lamps. Charlotte knows. Undoubtedly. Nathaniel studied him carefully. The question is whether she cares. Alexander remembered every encounter he had shared with Charlotte. The reading society. The clinic. The luncheon. Her quiet confidence. Her refusal to seek approval. She cares, he said quietly. She simply refuses to let people see it. Nathaniel's expression softened slightly. You understand her better than you did a month ago. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Several days later, their paths crossed again. This time at an outdoor charity event held in Hyde Park. Spring sunshine finally broke through the clouds. Families strolled along pathways lined with blooming flowers. Musicians performed beneath white tents. Volunteers collected donations for local schools. Charlotte spent most of the afternoon assisting organizers and greeting supporters. She enjoyed events like this. They focused on purpose rather than performance. Unfortunately, even purpose could not entirely escape gossip. While speaking with a donor near one of the tents, Charlotte overheard two women standing nearby. There she is. Do you think it is true? Everyone says so. Imagine pursuing a duke after already suffering one public rejection. The word struck harder than she expected. Not because they were cruel. Because they resurrected memories she preferred buried. For an instant, the noise around her faded. 5 years disappeared. She saw another ballroom. Another season. Another future that had collapsed before it truly began. The memory passed quickly. Yet it left behind a familiar ache. Charlotte inhaled slowly. Then continued her conversation as though nothing had happened. Across the lawn, Alexander had witnessed the entire exchange. He had arrived only minutes earlier. Just in time to see the women whisper. Just in time to see Charlotte's expression change. Most observers would have missed it. The shift lasted less than a second. Alexander did not miss it. For the first time, he saw clear evidence that the rumors were hurting her. Not visibly. Not dramatically. Yet they were hurting her nonetheless. Charlotte smiled. continued speaking. Maintained perfect composure. The performance was flawless. That somehow made it worse. The two women eventually drifted away. Charlotte turned toward another group of guests. She never noticed Alexander watching from across the lawn. But he continued watching. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Society had learned nothing. 5 years ago, people had transformed her heartbreak into entertainment. Now they were doing it again. Different story. Same cruelty. A few minutes later, Charlotte excused herself from the crowd and walked toward a quieter section of the gardens. She needed a moment alone. Just a few minutes away from smiles and assumptions and endless speculation. The path curved beside a row of flowering trees. Birds sang overhead. The afternoon should have felt peaceful. Instead, exhaustion pressed against her like a weight. "Miss Bennet." She stopped. The voice behind her was instantly recognizable. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly before turning around. Alexander Sterling stood several feet away. Sunlight filtered through the branches above him. For a moment neither spoke. Then he noticed something unusual. Her smile was gone. Not replaced by anger. Not sadness. Simply gone. And for the first time since meeting her, Alexander understood that dignity often looked very similar to loneliness. Charlotte met his gaze across the quiet garden path and immediately understood two things. First, Alexander Sterling had witnessed more than she would have preferred. Second, he was not going to leave. The realization should have annoyed her. Instead, it simply made her tired. "Your Grace." Her voice remained perfectly polite. "Miss Bennet." For a moment neither moved. The sounds of the charity event drifted through the trees behind them. Laughter. Music. Conversation. Life continuing as though nothing had changed. Alexander studied her carefully. Gone was the easy smile she wore for the public. Gone was the calm amusement that usually accompanied their encounters. What remained was a woman who looked exhausted from carrying burdens she never discussed. "You left rather suddenly," he said. Charlotte almost laughed. "I walked approximately 80 yards. You know what I mean." "Unfortunately, I do." The honesty of the reply surprised them both. Alexander hesitated. He was not accustomed to these conversations. Estate negotiations. Parliamentary debates. Business agreements. Those he understood. This felt entirely different. More dangerous somehow. "I heard what those women said." Charlotte looked away toward the flowering trees. "Then I am sorry you were subjected to such tedious conversation. You are avoiding the issue. Perhaps because discussing it will not improve it." Alexander frowned. "Does it not anger you?" Charlotte was quiet for several seconds. When she finally answered, her voice was softer. "Not everything painful is anger." The word settled between them. Alexander felt an unexpected sense of shame. Not because of the rumors. Because he suddenly realized how much suffering could exist beneath composure. Society rewarded women for appearing unaffected. It rarely considered the cost. Charlotte folded her hands in front of her. People enjoy stories. Even cruel ones. Especially cruel ones. A faint smile touched her lips, though sadness lingered behind it. Happy people are rarely interesting to gossip about. Alexander found himself studying her more closely than propriety allowed. 5 years. She had endured 5 years of whispers, assumptions, and speculation. Yet she still devoted her time to helping strangers. Still attended social functions. Still carried herself with dignity. Most people would have become bitter. Charlotte somehow had not. "You should not have to endure this." The words escaped before he could reconsider them. Charlotte looked at him with mild surprise. "Endure what?" "Being treated unfairly." Her expression softened slightly. "Life is unfair to everyone eventually, Your Grace. That is not an excuse." Something flashed across her face. Not amusement. Not irritation. Something closer to curiosity. As though she had not expected that response from him. Neither had Alexander. Before either could continue, voices approached from the nearby path. Several guests from the charity event appeared around the corner. Charlotte immediately straightened. The private moment vanished. Society returned. Miss Bennet. Lady Caroline Graves approached with 3 companions. Her smile was flawless. There you are. Charlotte greeted her politely. Alexander remained silent. Caroline's eyes moved between them. Satisfaction flickered briefly behind her pleasant expression. How fortunate, she said. I was just telling Lady Harrington that one never knows where one might encounter old friends. Charlotte understood the trap immediately. So did Alexander. Lady Harrington glanced between them with open curiosity. Indeed. Caroline laughed lightly. Although perhaps not entirely unexpected in this case. The implication hung in the air. Deliberate. Elegant. Poisonous. Charlotte felt the familiar weariness return. Here it was again. Another conversation transformed into speculation. Another moment reduced to gossip. She had grown accustomed to it. That did not mean it hurt less. I am afraid I do not understand, Charlotte said calmly. Caroline's smile widened. Do you not? Alexander saw the satisfaction in Caroline's eyes. He saw the anticipation in the others. They wanted Charlotte to defend herself. To explain. To justify her presence. The realization ignited something sharp and unpleasant inside him. There is nothing to understand. Every head turned toward him. Caroline blinked. Your Grace? Alexander's expression remained cool. Miss Bennet is involved in organizing today's event. His voice carried the effortless authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Surely that explains her presence more convincingly than idle speculation. Silence followed. Lady Harrington looked embarrassed. One of the other women suddenly became fascinated by the flowers. Caroline recovered quickly, though disappointment flickered beneath her smile. Of course. I meant no offense. Then you succeeded admirably. The word sounded polite. They were not. Charlotte stared at Alexander in surprise. So did everyone else? Caroline's smile faltered. Only slightly. Yet it was enough. I see. She inclined her head. Please excuse us. Moments later the women moved away down the path. Their departure left behind a strange silence. Charlotte looked at Alexander. That was unnecessary. Was it? I am capable of managing Lady Caroline. I know. He paused. That does not mean you should have to. Charlotte had no immediate response. The answer unsettled her more than she cared to admit. For years, people had watched. Commented. Whispered. Very few had intervened. Fewer still without expecting something in return. Alexander glanced toward the retreating figures. She enjoys provoking people. She enjoys controlling narratives. Charlotte sighed softly. There is a difference. Not a significant one. For the first time that afternoon, genuine amusement touched her eyes. Brief. Fleeting. Yet real. Alexander noticed. Unfortunately, so did Charlotte. The awareness created an uncomfortable moment neither quite understood. She looked away first. Thank you. The words were quiet. You are welcome. Another silence followed. Not awkward. Merely unfamiliar. Somewhere in the distance, a string quartet began playing. Spring sunlight filtered through the branches above them. For a few moments, the world felt unexpectedly peaceful. Then a small voice interrupted. Miss Bennet. A young girl of perhaps 10 years old hurried down the path carrying a basket of donation cards. Charlotte immediately smiled. Emily. The child stopped beside her. "We need more collection sheets near the south tent." "I will come help." Emily nodded enthusiastically. Then she noticed Alexander. Her eyes widened. "Are you a duke?" Alexander blinked. Charlotte pressed her lips together to hide a smile. "Emily," she said gently, "that is not an appropriate question." "Why not?" "Because it is rather personal." The girl considered this, then turned back to Alexander. "You look like a duke." To Charlotte's horror, Alexander laughed. A genuine laugh. Low and unexpected. Emily grinned triumphantly. "See?" Charlotte shook her head. "I apologize." "Do not." Alexander's expression softened as he looked at the child. "It is the most honest conversation I have had all week." Emily seemed pleased by this assessment. A moment later she remembered her mission and hurried back toward the event. Charlotte watched her go. She lost both parents last year. And now? Now she reads every book she can find and asks impossible questions. Alexander looked at her. "Like someone else I know." Charlotte rolled her eyes. "I should return to work." Yet neither moved immediately. The moment lingered. Quiet. Unexpectedly comfortable. Then reality returned. A messenger approached from the main event carrying a folded note. "Miss Bennet." He handed her the paper. Charlotte opened it. As she read, the color drained slightly from her face. Alexander noticed instantly. "What is it?" She folded the note. Too quickly. "Nothing." The answer was unconvincing. "Miss Bennet." She looked away. A volunteer from the Reading Society. Her voice remained steady. "Someone delivered several anonymous letters this morning." Alexander's expression hardened. "Letters?" Charlotte nodded. Nothing serious. Yet her fingers tightened around the paper. Simply unpleasant. Alexander did not need further explanation. The rumors were escalating. No longer confined to drawing rooms and ballrooms. They were reaching into the work she cared about most. He felt anger stir again. Stronger this time. Charlotte seemed to sense it. "Please do not look like that." "Like what?" "Like you intend to challenge London itself." An appealing idea. Despite everything, she laughed. Softly. Wearily. But she laughed. The sound eased something inside him. Then she tucked the note into her reticule and squared her shoulders. The vulnerable expression disappeared. The composed Charlotte Bennet returned. "The children still need books," she said. "The clinic still needs supplies. The Reading Society still needs funding." She met his gaze steadily. "Life continues." Alexander looked at her for a long moment. At her courage. At her exhaustion. At the strength she carried so quietly that most people never noticed it at all. And for the first time, he understood that what impressed him most was not her resilience. It was the fact that she remained kind despite everything. Charlotte inclined her head politely. "Good afternoon, Your Grace." Then she turned and walked back toward the crowded charity event. Toward responsibilities. Toward rumors. Toward people who would continue judging her without knowing her. Alexander watched her disappear into the crowd. This time, however, something had changed. The guilt remained. The respect had deepened. But another emotion now stood beside them. One far more dangerous than either. Because for the first time since their paths had crossed, Alexander Sterling no longer found himself merely curious about Charlotte Bennet. He found himself wanting to protect her. 3 days after the charity event, invitations arrived across London for the Hartwell Spring Ball. Every season possessed one gathering capable of drawing nearly every influential family into the same ballroom. This year, the Hartwell event held that distinction. By the afternoon of the ball, anticipation had spread through Mayfair with remarkable speed. Mothers discussed prospects. Daughters discussed gowns. Gentlemen discussed everything except the fact that they intended to attend for exactly the same reasons. Charlotte Bennet would have preferred to remain home. Unfortunately, Lady Margaret Whitmore possessed little patience for avoidance. "You are going." Margaret sat comfortably in Charlotte's drawing room while a maid adjusted ribbons on a pale silver evening gown. "I have already sent our acceptance." Charlotte looked up from the book she had been attempting to read. "You accepted on my behalf?" "Naturally." "That seems suspiciously authoritarian." "That is because it was." Margaret smiled. "You have spent 2 weeks hiding behind charitable work." "I was not hiding." "You organized 3 fundraising meetings, reviewed accounts for 2 organizations, and personally visited every project under your supervision." "Those things needed doing." "Charlotte." Margaret folded her arms. "You are avoiding society." Charlotte returned her attention to the book. "Society appears quite capable of surviving without me." "That is not the point." The older woman studied her carefully. "You cannot allow Caroline Graves to chase you from every ballroom in London." Charlotte sighed softly. The frustrating part was that Margaret was correct. Retreat would only confirm the rumors. "Very well." Margaret immediately looked pleased. "Excellent. I dislike when you are right." "That is because it happens so often." Several hours later, Charlotte stood near the grand entrance of Hartwell House while guests flowed steadily into the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers illuminated polished marble floors. Fresh flowers decorated every corner. Music drifted from an elevated orchestra platform. The room glowed with wealth, elegance, and ambition. Charlotte recognized many faces. Some greeted her warmly. Others offered smiles that concealed curiosity. A few openly observed her as though she represented a puzzle requiring solution. She ignored them all. Experience had made such attention easier to endure. Across the ballroom, Lady Caroline Graves arrived wearing deep emerald silk and enough confidence to illuminate the room without assistance from candles. Several gentlemen immediately approached her. Caroline accepted their admiration gracefully. Yet her gaze moved repeatedly toward the entrance. Waiting. Searching. Charlotte suspected she knew for whom. The answer arrived 20 minutes later. A subtle shift passed through the crowd. Conversations lowered. Heads turned. The Duke of Ravenshire entered the ballroom. Charlotte looked away immediately. Unfortunately, not before noticing that he looked directly at her. The realization annoyed her more than it should have. Over the past several weeks, Alexander had appeared with increasing frequency in her thoughts. She disliked that fact. It suggested a lack of discipline she preferred not to examine closely. "You noticed him?" Margaret appeared beside her carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. Charlotte accepted one. "The entire room noticed him." "That was not my question." Charlotte took a sip. "You are becoming tiresome." Margaret laughed. "That means I am correct." Before Charlotte could respond, the orchestra began a new waltz. Couples moved toward the dance floor. The familiar ritual repeated itself throughout the room. Invitations extended. Partners selected. Social calculations performed with remarkable efficiency. Charlotte remained where she was. She enjoyed observing dances considerably more than participating in them. That preference had developed over years of necessity. After the scandal surrounding her broken engagement, invitations had gradually become less frequent. People often assumed rejection became easier with repetition. It did not. One merely learned how to hide disappointment more effectively. "Would you care to dance?" Margaret asked. Charlotte nearly choked on her lemonade. "With whom?" "Anyone." "That seems unlikely." "Nonsense." Margaret looked around the room. "There must be at least one intelligent gentleman present." "Your optimism is admirable." The music continued. Couples circled gracefully beneath the chandeliers. Charlotte watched with detached amusement. Then a hush began spreading through the ballroom. Not the usual hush that accompanied a duke's arrival. Something different. Something sharper. Charlotte noticed people turning toward the far side of the room. Whispers followed. Then silence. Slowly, she turned. Alexander Sterling was walking directly toward her. Every instinct urged her to look away. She did not. The ballroom seemed to narrow. Guests stopped speaking. Even the musicians appeared aware that something unusual was happening. Margaret made a very suspicious sound beside her. Charlotte ignored it. Alexander reached them moments later. His expression remained calm. Controlled. Yet something in his eyes looked determined. Lady Whitmore. Your Grace. Margaret's innocence was entirely unconvincing. Alexander turned toward Charlotte. For a brief moment neither spoke. Then he extended his hand. Miss Bennet. The entire ballroom appeared to stop breathing. Would you honor me with this dance? Silence crashed through the room. Charlotte heard it. Felt it. Hundreds of people watching. Waiting. Shocked. Somewhere across the ballroom, Caroline Graves went completely still. Charlotte stared at Alexander's outstretched hand. Her pulse quickened unexpectedly. Not because of the invitation itself. Because she understood exactly what accepting would mean. Every rumor would intensify. Every whisper would multiply. Every glance would become sharper. Alexander seemed to understand her hesitation. It is only a dance, he said quietly. The statement might have been convincing if delivered by literally anyone else. Charlotte almost smiled. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes. No. Another silence followed. Larger this time. More stunned. Alexander blinked once. Clearly he had expected hesitation. Perhaps even refusal after consideration. He had not expected an immediate answer. No. Charlotte's voice remained gentle. Polite. Entirely steady. I appreciate the invitation, Your Grace. But no. Around them, society struggled collectively to process what had just occurred. A duke had publicly requested a dance. The woman in question had declined. Such things did not happen. Not in London. Not in any ballroom governed by social convention. Yet they had just happened. Alexander lowered his hand slowly. Surprise flickered across his face. Real surprise. The kind that could not be hidden quickly enough. For a second, Charlotte almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then she remembered another ballroom. Another public moment. Another lesson about dignity. Enjoy the evening, she said softly. Before he could respond, she curtsied and walked away. The crowd parted automatically. Nobody attempted to stop her. Nobody seemed capable of speech. Charlotte crossed the ballroom with measured steps. Calm. Composed. Inside, her heart pounded so hard she feared someone might hear it. She reached a side corridor and finally exhaled. What had she done? The answer arrived immediately. Protected herself. For 5 years, she had rebuilt a life from the ruins of public humiliation. She would not place her peace in someone else's hands again. Not even a duke's. Especially not a duke's. Back inside the ballroom, Alexander remained exactly where she had left him. The orchestra faltered briefly before recovering. Conversations resumed in scattered bursts. Whispers erupted across every corner of the room. Yet Alexander barely heard any of it. Nathaniel Mercer appeared beside him moments later. Well. Alexander looked at his friend. Do not. Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully. You were rejected. Thank you for clarifying. Publicly. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. Nathaniel. By the only woman in London who apparently does not care that you are a duke. The solicitor's amusement became impossible to hide. Across the room, however, Lady Caroline's reaction proved very different. Satisfaction lit her expression. For the first time in weeks, she appeared genuinely pleased. Alexander noticed. The sight irritated him immediately. Not because she enjoyed his embarrassment. Because she clearly expected him to retreat. To abandon the matter entirely. He looked toward the doorway through which Charlotte had disappeared. An unfamiliar realization settled over him. He was not angry. Embarrassed, certainly. Surprised, unquestionably. But not angry. If anything, he respected her more than before. She had refused him for the same reason she had laughed weeks earlier. Because she valued herself enough to walk away. Most people spent their lives seeking favor from power. Charlotte Bennet seemed determined to prove she could live without it. The realization should have discouraged him. Instead, it accomplished something far more dangerous. For the first time in years, Alexander Sterling wanted something he could not simply obtain by asking. And that made him impossible to ignore. By the following morning, every drawing room in Mayfair had adopted a new favorite topic. The Duke of Ravenshire had asked Charlotte Bennet to dance. Charlotte Bennet had refused. London discussed little else. Charlotte herself spent the morning reviewing school accounts and pretending none of it existed. The effort failed almost immediately. You rejected a duke. Margaret Whitmore set down her teacup with remarkable emphasis. I am aware. In public. I was present. Charlotte. Margaret leaned forward. Do you understand how astonishing that is? Charlotte finished signing a document before looking up. You are speaking as though I challenged Parliament to a duel. This is worse. Margaret shook her head. Parliament would recover more quickly. Despite herself, Charlotte laughed. The sound faded almost as quickly as it appeared. The previous evening continued replaying in her thoughts. Alexander's expression when she refused him. The surprise. The confusion. Most of all, the disappointment he had not managed to conceal completely. She should not have noticed it. Unfortunately, she had. Do you regret it? Margaret asked quietly. Charlotte stared at the ledger before her. No. The answer came too quickly. Margaret noticed. Of course she noticed. You are lying. I am not. Then why do you sound unconvinced? Charlotte closed the ledger. Because I dislike hurting people unnecessarily. Margaret studied her for several seconds. You think you hurt him? Did I not? Possibly. The older woman smiled faintly. It may do him good. Across London, Alexander Sterling was receiving similar observations from considerably less sympathetic sources. Nathaniel Mercer appeared at Ravenshire House before noon carrying a stack of correspondence and entirely too much amusement. I counted 6 separate letters mentioning the ball. Alexander did not look up from the report he was reading. How unfortunate. One gentleman described the event as historic. Nathaniel. Another called it poetic justice. Alexander finally raised his eyes. You seem determined to shorten your life expectancy. Nathaniel sat comfortably across from the desk. How are you feeling? Busy. Disappointed. Alexander returned his attention to the report. The silence answered the question more effectively than words. Nathaniel's expression softened slightly. You know, most men would retreat after such public rejection. Most men are not relevant to this conversation. Ah. Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully. That bad. Alexander should have denied it. Instead, he found himself staring through the study window toward the city beyond. She had every reason to refuse. Yes. The admission surprised even him. I gave her those reasons myself. Nathaniel said nothing. Sometimes friendship required silence more than advice. 2 days later, Charlotte attended a fundraising luncheon for several educational charities. The event occupied a large assembly room near Westminster. Teachers, benefactors, and local officials filled the space. Unlike fashionable society gatherings, conversation centered on practical concerns rather than personal scandals. Charlotte appreciated that. Unfortunately, rumors traveled remarkably well regardless of setting. She had just finished discussing curriculum improvements with a headmistress when she noticed several women observing her from across the room. One of them immediately looked away. Another whispered something behind her fan. The third smiled. Charlotte recognized the smile. It belonged to someone who believed she possessed information others lacked. Her stomach tightened slightly. By now she knew the pattern. The rumors were changing. Evolving. Growing. She excused herself and crossed toward a refreshment table. Before she arrived, another voice intercepted her. "Miss Bennet." Charlotte turned. Lady Caroline Graves approached wearing pale blue silk and a smile polished to perfection. "Lady Caroline. How lovely to see you." Charlotte doubted the sincerity of the statement. Caroline's smile widened. Everyone is still discussing the ball. There it was. Direct and deliberate. Charlotte reached for a glass of lemonade. Society rarely lacks enthusiasm for repetition. True. Caroline lowered her voice slightly. Although some stories are particularly fascinating. Charlotte remained silent. Caroline moved closer. "You surprised everyone. I imagine disappointment can be educational." "Indeed." Caroline's eyes sharpened. "Although many people believe your refusal was merely strategy." Charlotte set down her glass. Slowly. Carefully. "Strategy. Surely you have heard." Caroline sounded almost sympathetic. "The prevailing theory suggests you wish to attract greater attention." The cruelty of the statement rested entirely in its elegance. Charlotte felt it immediately. Not because she believed it. Because she knew others would. Caroline continued before she could respond. "Personally, I find such speculation unfair." The lie was almost impressive. "How kind of you." "I simply dislike seeing women misrepresented." Charlotte looked directly into her eyes. "Then this must be a difficult season for you." For a brief second, Caroline's composure cracked. The victory lasted only an instant. Yet it was enough. Caroline's smile returned. "Colder this time." "Be careful, Charlotte." "About what?" "People eventually grow tired of chasing attention." The implication was unmistakable. Then Caroline glided away before further conversation became necessary. Charlotte stood perfectly still. Around her, voices blended into a dull hum. For the first time in weeks, anger slipped through the cracks of her composure. Not because of the insult itself. Because she finally understood what Caroline intended. This was not random gossip. It was a campaign. Deliberate. Patient. Calculated. Someone was attempting to transform her into a caricature. An ambitious woman chasing a duke. A desperate woman seeking status. A woman willing to manipulate attention. Everything Charlotte despised. Everything she was not. The realization followed her home. It remained during dinner. It lingered while she reviewed correspondence. Long after midnight, she sat alone in the library staring into the fire. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The house slept around her. Yet sleep refused to come. She thought about Alexander. About the rumors. About Caroline. Most of all, she thought about the exhausting unfairness of it all. If she accepted his attention, she became ambitious. If she rejected it, she became manipulative. Society demanded explanations for every choice a woman made. Then criticized whichever explanation it invented. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Her aunt entered carrying a letter. This arrived after dinner. Charlotte accepted the envelope. No return address appeared on the front. Her stomach tightened immediately. Anonymous correspondence had become increasingly common. Most letters contained nothing truly threatening. Merely unpleasant observations disguised as advice. She unfolded the paper. Her expression hardened as she read. "Charlotte," her aunt asked softly. Charlotte folded the letter again. Nothing important. Another lie. The note accused her of pursuing Alexander. of embarrassing herself publicly, of refusing the dance only to encourage further attention. The language remained polite. The cruelty did not. Her aunt sighed. Burn it. Perhaps. Definitely. Charlotte looked toward the fire. For once, she obeyed. The paper curled quickly beneath the flames. Yet the words remained. The next afternoon brought an unexpected development. Alexander visited the Westminster Clinic to review a funding proposal. Officially. Unofficially, he suspected his reasons were becoming increasingly transparent. He found Charlotte in a small office reviewing supply inventories. She looked tired. More tired than usual. The realization bothered him immediately. Miss Bennet. She looked up. Surprise flickered across her face. Then caution followed. Your Grace. Alexander closed the door behind him. You appear unwell. Charlotte blinked. That is a remarkably direct greeting. You did not answer the question. She lowered her eyes to the inventory list. I am fine. You are not. The certainty in his voice caught her off guard. For several moments neither spoke. Then Charlotte sighed quietly. It has been an unpleasant week. Alexander felt irritation stir. Because of the rumors. It was not a question. Charlotte looked at him sharply. How much have you heard? Enough. Then you understand why I preferred not to discuss them. Alexander stepped closer. You should not have to defend yourself against lies. Charlotte laughed softly. There was no humor in the sound. That is a lovely sentiment. It is also true. Truth rarely determines public opinion. Alexander stared at her. At the exhaustion she tried to hide. At the sadness she refused to acknowledge. Something inside him tightened painfully. Charlotte. The use of her name surprised them both. She looked up immediately. Neither seemed certain what to do next. The room suddenly felt smaller. Quieter. More honest than either preferred. I am sorry. The words emerged quietly. For what? The ball. The rumors. Everything that followed. Charlotte searched his face. No pride. No arrogance. Only sincerity. The sight unsettled her more than any argument could have. You did not create all of it. I created enough. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Merely fragile. Then a nurse knocked hurriedly on the office door. Miss Bennet. Charlotte stepped back immediately. The moment shattered. Yes? There is a problem. Concern replaced exhaustion. What happened? The nurse hesitated. Several donors withdrew support this morning. Charlotte's expression changed instantly. Why? The nurse looked uncomfortable. They heard certain rumors. The room went completely silent. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. Just once. It lasted less than a second. Yet Alexander saw it. The disappointment. The hurt. The frustration. Not for herself. For the people who would suffer because of it. When she opened her eyes again, composure had returned. Thank you, she told the nurse. I will handle it. The nurse departed. Charlotte looked toward the window. For the first time since Alexander had known her, she seemed genuinely shaken. Charlotte. She did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet. Do you know what the worst part is? Alexander waited. She smiled sadly. The children will never know why fewer books arrive this month. Those words remained with him long after he left the clinic. Because for the first time, the rumors were no longer merely cruel. They were causing real harm. And somewhere beneath the growing anger, a dangerous certainty began to form. Someone had started this. Someone was feeding it. Someone wanted Charlotte Bennet destroyed socially. Alexander intended to discover who. And when he did, London was going to learn that he was far less forgiving than Charlotte. Alexander Sterling did not sleep well that night. The image remained fixed in his mind. Charlotte standing in the clinic office. Tired. Composed. Heartbroken for other people rather than herself. Most individuals would have focused on their own reputation. Charlotte worried about children losing books. The contrast disturbed him more than he cared to admit. By dawn, he had reached a decision. If he wanted answers, he would stop relying upon rumors. The truth existed somewhere beneath 5 years of gossip and assumptions. He intended to find it. 3 days later, that opportunity arrived unexpectedly. Alexander attended a small luncheon hosted by Lord and Lady Pembroke. Unlike most fashionable gatherings, this event focused on education reform and charitable funding. The guest list remained intentionally limited. Politicians. Philanthropists. Community leaders. People interested in practical results rather than social spectacle. Charlotte attended as well. Alexander noticed her immediately. Not because she stood out. Quite the opposite. She occupied a quiet corner near a bookshelf, speaking with a schoolmaster about literacy programs. Several guests approached her throughout the afternoon. Teachers. Clergy members. Local officials. Every conversation appeared respectful. Familiar. Genuine. The pattern reinforced everything Alexander had already discovered. Outside society's gossip circles, people valued Charlotte for entirely different reasons. Near the end of the luncheon, rain began falling heavily against the windows. Several guests departed early to avoid worsening weather. Others gathered in the library to wait for their carriages. Alexander found himself standing beside a fireplace while Charlotte reviewed documents with Lord Pembroke. Their discussion continued nearly 20 minutes. Detailed. Intelligent. Practical. He watched her solve a funding dispute in less than 5 minutes. Calmly. Efficiently. Without seeking recognition afterward. You are staring. Nathaniel Mercer appeared beside him carrying 2 glasses of brandy. Alexander accepted one. I am observing. That explanation grows less convincing every week. Alexander ignored him. Nathaniel followed his gaze toward Charlotte. Interesting woman. Yes. That was immediate. Alexander glanced at his friend. Nathaniel's smile widened. You are in trouble. I am not. Of course. Nathaniel drank his brandy. You merely spend every waking hour thinking about her? Before Alexander could formulate a response, Charlotte unexpectedly looked up from her conversation. Their eyes met briefly across the room. She looked away first. Yet something felt different this time. Not distant. Not guarded. Merely thoughtful. The moment lingered long after it ended. Later that afternoon, the rain intensified. Carriages experienced delays. Several guests remained stranded inside Pembroke House longer than expected. The unexpected extension created smaller conversations throughout the library. Charlotte eventually found herself seated near a window overlooking the gardens. A book rested unopened in her lap. For once, she seemed content to enjoy the silence. Alexander crossed the room before he could reconsider. Miss Bennet. Charlotte looked up. Your Grace. He hesitated. Then sat in the chair opposite hers. Neither spoke immediately. Rain tapped steadily against the glass. The library remained comfortably warm. Several guests conversed quietly nearby. Yet the small space between them felt oddly separate from everything else. How is the Reading Society? Alexander asked. Charlotte smiled faintly. Recovering. The donations. Some returned. Relief flickered unexpectedly through him. Good. Lord Pembroke helped. She studied him briefly. I suspect others may have helped as well. Alexander said nothing. His silence confirmed enough. Charlotte lowered her eyes. Thank you. You do not need to thank me. I do. Her voice softened. Most people find it easier to walk away from problems that do not affect them personally. Alexander considered that. Perhaps they should not. The answer seemed to surprise her. Another silence followed. Comfortable this time. Less guarded than previous encounters. Then Charlotte asked a question he did not expect. Why are you doing this? Alexander met her gaze. Doing what? Helping. She folded her hands carefully. You barely knew me a month ago. The honesty of the observation left little room for evasion. Alexander thought about giving a polite answer. Instead, he found himself choosing truth. Because I was wrong. Charlotte blinked. About what? You. The words settled between them. Simple. Direct. Genuine. For a moment, Charlotte appeared uncertain how to respond. Alexander continued quietly. I judged you without knowing you. Most people do. That does not excuse it. Charlotte looked toward the rain-streaked window. No. Another pause. Then Alexander asked the question that had haunted him for weeks. What happened 5 years ago? The room suddenly felt smaller. Charlotte became very still. For an instant, he thought she might leave. Instead, she stared at the rain beyond the glass. Her expression unreadable. You do not have to answer, Alexander said. I know. Yet she remained silent. Long enough for him to understand how difficult the subject truly was. Finally she spoke. His name was Edward Langley. Alexander listened. We were engaged for almost a year. Her voice remained calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that only developed after surviving something painful enough to reshape a life. He was kind. Intelligent. Charming. A faint smile appeared. Sad and distant. Everyone approved. And? Charlotte's fingers tightened slightly around the closed book resting in her lap. 3 days before the wedding, he informed me he had fallen in love with someone else. Alexander felt something twist sharply inside his chest. 3 days. She nodded. At least he told me before the ceremony. The attempt at humor failed completely. Charlotte. She continued looking out the window. He married her 6 months later. Alexander struggled to find words. None seemed adequate. I am sorry. Charlotte smiled faintly. So was everyone else. The answer carried years of experience. Years of pity. Years of whispers. Years of being remembered for the worst moment of her life. What happened afterward? He asked quietly. Charlotte laughed once. Softly. Without amusement. London happened. The simplicity of the statement hurt more than a detailed explanation could have. Alexander suddenly understood. Not completely. Perhaps he never could. But enough. Enough to imagine a young woman standing beneath public scrutiny while her heartbreak became entertainment. Enough to understand why she valued dignity so fiercely. Enough to understand why she had refused his invitation at the ball. Charlotte finally looked at him. People think the humiliation was the worst part. Was it not? She shook her head. No. Her voice became very quiet. The worst part was realizing how quickly people stopped seeing me as a person. The honesty of the confession stole his breath. Charlotte. I became a story. She smiled sadly. A lesson. A warning. A source of gossip. The library blurred slightly around Alexander. For the first time, he saw the full weight she carried. Not simply heartbreak. Isolation. Society had reduced her to a single moment and refused to let her move beyond it. So I made a decision. He listened carefully. What decision? Her eyes softened. If people insisted upon talking about me, I would give them less time to do it. The charities. The schools. The clinic. The reading society. She nodded. Other people needed help more than I needed sympathy. Alexander stared at her. The answer explained everything. Every act of kindness. Every project. Every effort. Charlotte had transformed pain into purpose. Not because she wanted admiration. Because she refused to waste suffering. The realization left him humbled. Deeply humbled. Nearby, someone called Charlotte's name. The moment fractured. Reality returned. Guests prepared to depart as the rain finally began easing. Charlotte stood slowly. I should go. Alexander rose as well. Neither seemed eager to end the conversation. Yet both understood it had reached its natural conclusion. Charlotte gathered her gloves and book. Then paused. You know something amusing? What? A genuine smile touched her lips. Small but real. You are the first person in years who asked what happened. Alexander frowned. What do people usually ask? Her smile faded slightly. Whether I am over it. Before he could respond, she turned and walked toward the others, leaving him standing beside the window. Watching. Thinking. Understanding. And as Alexander Sterling looked out at the rain-soaked gardens beyond the glass, one realization became impossible to ignore. Charlotte Bennet had survived the kind of heartbreak that taught people never to trust again. Yet somehow she had remained kind. And that made her far more extraordinary than anyone in London realized. Meanwhile, across the room, Lady Caroline Graves stood partially concealed near a bookshelf. She had arrived late. Quietly. Unnoticed. And she had heard enough of the conversation to understand something dangerous. The Duke of Ravenshire no longer viewed Charlotte Bennet as a curiosity. He cared. Caroline's expression hardened. Because if that was true, then the rumors had failed. And if the rumors had failed, she would need something far more powerful to separate them. For the first time in years, Alexander Sterling stopped pretending the situation could be explained by curiosity. Curiosity had ended weeks ago. Respect had followed. Admiration had arrived shortly afterward. What remained now was far more dangerous. He thought about Charlotte when he woke in the morning. He thought about her during meetings. He found traces of her in conversations, in books, in charitable reports, and in every discussion regarding the future. The realization should have alarmed him. Instead, it felt strangely inevitable. 2 days after the luncheon at Pembroke House, Alexander stood in the library of Ravenshire House while Nathaniel Mercer reviewed estate correspondence. Rain had finally given way to clear spring skies. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows. Yet Alexander paid little attention to the weather. You are smiling. Nathaniel looked up from a letter. Alexander frowned. I am not. You absolutely are. Nathaniel folded the document and set it aside. That expression is particularly concerning. Why? Because it suggests self-awareness. Alexander moved toward the fireplace. You spend an unreasonable amount of time commenting on my behavior. Someone must. Nathaniel leaned back comfortably. Have you told her? Alexander stopped walking. Told her what? Nathaniel looked genuinely offended. Please do not insult my intelligence. Silence answered the question. Nathaniel sighed dramatically. Of course not. The matter is more complicated than that. Only because you insist upon making it complicated. Alexander stared into the flames. She does not trust me. Can you blame her? The answer arrived immediately. No. He could not. Not after their first encounter. Not after the ballroom. Not after everything that followed. Nathaniel's voice softened. Then earn it. Alexander looked toward the window. The advice sounded simple. Unfortunately, it was also correct. That same afternoon, Charlotte sat in the Reading Society office reviewing a shipment of educational materials recently donated by an anonymous benefactor. The delivery included nearly twice the number of books originally requested. New desks had also arrived, along with writing supplies. Several volunteers moved excitedly through the building, organizing the unexpected resources. Charlotte examined the donation records again. "No name?" she asked. "None." One of the volunteers smiled. "Perhaps a wealthy admirer." Charlotte rolled her eyes. "Let us hope not." Yet even as she spoke, she suspected the truth. Later that evening, confirmation arrived. A handwritten note accompanied another contribution to the clinic. The message contained only one sentence. "For the children." No signature appeared beneath the words. None was necessary. Charlotte stared at the note longer than she should have. Her feelings on the matter remained frustratingly complicated. Gratitude. Certainly. Suspicion. Also certainly. Alexander's kindness felt genuine. That was precisely the problem. Genuine kindness had become difficult to trust. Several days later, fate placed them together once more. Lady Whitmore hosted a small gathering at her townhouse. Unlike the grand social events dominating the season, this evening focused on close friends and family. The guest list remained intentionally limited. Charlotte accepted primarily because Margaret threatened to arrive personally and drag her there if necessary. Upon entering the drawing room, she immediately regretted underestimating Margaret's determination. Alexander was already present. "You planned this?" Margaret appeared beside her almost instantly. "Planned what?" "Whatever this is." Margaret's expression radiated innocence. It was deeply unconvincing. "Charlotte, dear, I am far too old to manipulate people." That is the least believable statement I have heard all month. Margaret laughed and escaped before further accusations could be made. Charlotte considered leaving. Unfortunately, doing so would only reward Margaret's efforts. Instead, she accepted a glass of lemonade and prepared herself for the evening. Several hours passed surprisingly pleasantly. Conversation flowed naturally. The atmosphere remained relaxed. For once, nobody discussed scandals, rumors, or marriage prospects. Charlotte almost managed to enjoy herself. Then she found herself alone with Alexander near the terrace doors. The moment felt suspiciously orchestrated. "Lady Whitmore is responsible for this," Charlotte said. Alexander glanced around the room. "Almost certainly." To her surprise, he sounded equally resigned. "Good. Why?" "Because it means neither of us should be blamed." The answer drew a laugh from him. Genuine. Warm. Charlotte hated how much she liked the sound. Outside, twilight settled across the garden. Lanterns glowed softly among flowering hedges. Through the glass doors, spring roses swayed in the evening breeze. The scene felt almost unreal. Too peaceful. Too beautiful. Too dangerous. "You seem happier lately." The observation escaped before Charlotte could stop it. Alexander looked surprised. "Do I?" "A little." "That may be your influence." Charlotte immediately regretted the question. "I should not have asked." "Why?" "Because now I do not know how to respond." Amusement flickered in his eyes. "That is fair." Silence settled between them. Yet unlike previous silences, this one felt comfortable. Easy. The realization unsettled Charlotte deeply. Several months earlier, she would have considered such comfort impossible. Alexander seemed to sense her withdrawal. His expression softened. "Charlotte." The use of her name no longer sounded strange. That fact alarmed her. "Yes?" He hesitated. For perhaps the first time since she had known him, uncertainty appeared on his face. Real uncertainty. Not strategic. Not controlled. Human. "May I ask you something?" Charlotte nodded cautiously. "Do you believe people can change?" The question caught her off guard. She studied him carefully. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether they truly want to." Alexander absorbed the answer quietly. Then he looked directly at her. "I do." The words held far more meaning than the conversation required. Charlotte understood immediately. So did he. Neither looked away. For one dangerous moment, the room seemed to disappear. Then footsteps interrupted the silence. Other guests approached. Conversation resumed. The moment passed. Yet neither forgot it. Later that night, after returning home, Charlotte stood beside her bedroom window watching moonlight spill across the garden below. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt confused. Alexander had changed. There was no denying it anymore. The arrogance she first encountered had faded. The dismissive certainty had vanished. In its place stood a man trying to understand her. Trying to help. Trying to become better than he had been. The effort mattered more than she wanted it to. Across London, Alexander experienced a similarly restless evening. He sat alone in his study long after midnight. The house remained silent around him. A single lamp illuminated the desk. Charlotte's words echoed through his thoughts. "Do you believe people can change?" Yes. He did. Because he already had. The realization arrived with startling clarity. Months earlier, he had viewed status as a measure of worth. Now he found himself admiring a woman precisely because she valued character above status. Months earlier, he would have dismissed charity work as admirable but secondary. Now he understood its significance because Charlotte had shown him. Months earlier, he believed power solved most problems. Charlotte had taught him otherwise. The truth settled heavily upon him. He was in love with her. Not infatuated. Not fascinated. Not curious. Love. The certainty stole his breath. Yet it also created a painful new problem. Loving Charlotte Bennet did not mean she could love him in return. Especially not after everything he had done. The following afternoon, events took a darker turn. Nathaniel Mercer arrived at Ravenshire House carrying troubling news. "I found the source." Alexander immediately looked up from his desk. "The rumors?" Nathaniel nodded. "At least part of them." He placed several folded letters on the desk. Caroline Graves. Alexander's expression hardened. "Proof." "Enough." Nathaniel tapped the papers. "Servants. Correspondence. Witnesses." He paused. "She has been encouraging the stories for months." Alexander opened one of the documents. The evidence proved difficult to dismiss. Anonymous notes. Carefully planted comments. Strategic conversations. None of it illegal. All of it malicious. Why? Nathaniel asked quietly. Alexander already knew the answer. Caroline wanted a duchess's title. Charlotte stood in the way. The realization ignited cold anger. Yet before he could act, Nathaniel delivered another piece of news. "There is more." Alexander looked up. "What?" Nathaniel's expression darkened. "Caroline is preparing something larger." Silence filled the study. "How much larger?" Nathaniel hesitated. "I do not know." That answer disturbed Alexander more than certainty would have. Because Caroline Graves had already proven patient. Intelligent. Ruthless. If she was planning something bigger than rumors, Charlotte might not see it coming. And suddenly Alexander understood exactly what was at stake. This was no longer about reputation. No longer about gossip. No longer even about love. Someone intended to hurt Charlotte Bennet again. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Sterling realized there was absolutely nothing he would not do to prevent it. The warning lingered over the following week like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. Alexander could feel it approaching even when he could not yet see its shape. Nathaniel continued investigating discreetly. Servants were questioned. Correspondence examined. Patterns emerged. None of them reassured him. Meanwhile, Charlotte remained unaware of the full extent of the danger. She noticed only that the rumors had changed once again. They had become quieter, more focused, more deliberate. That troubled her far more than open gossip ever had. Open cruelty was easy to recognize. Hidden cruelty often arrived disguised as concern. The season's largest charitable gala took place on the first Friday of May. Hosted at the Grand Assembly Rooms in Mayfair, the event attracted nearly every influential family in London. Politicians attended. Noble families attended. Wealthy benefactors attended. The evening combined fundraising with social prestige, making absence nearly impossible for anyone wishing to remain visible within society. Charlotte almost declined the invitation. The clinic required attention. The Reading Society needed additional funding. Several schools were preparing summer programs. She possessed dozens of reasons to stay home. Unfortunately, Margaret Whitmore dismissed every one of them. "You are going." Charlotte looked up from a stack of reports. "I notice you have not asked for my opinion." "That is because I already know it." Margaret sat opposite her. "And it is wrong." Charlotte sighed. "I am not in the mood for ballrooms." "Then attend for the children." "That is emotional manipulation." "Yes." Margaret smiled pleasantly. "It remains effective." Several hours later, Charlotte entered the assembly rooms beneath a canopy of crystal chandeliers and golden light. The ballroom was magnificent. Fresh flowers decorated every corner. Musicians filled the air with elegant waltzes. Hundreds of guests moved through the room in carefully choreographed patterns of conversation and ambition. Charlotte immediately noticed Alexander standing near one of the far columns. Their eyes met briefly. Something warm flickered through her chest before she could stop it. She looked away at once. The reaction annoyed her. Across the room, Alexander experienced an equally frustrating response. The sight of Charlotte in a deep blue gown should not have affected him. Unfortunately, it did. She looked elegant, composed, beautiful. More importantly, she looked happy. At least for the moment. He found himself smiling before realizing it. Nathaniel noticed immediately. Hopeless. Alexander ignored him. Any updates? Nathaniel's expression became serious. Nothing definitive. Meaning I still believe Caroline is planning something. Alexander's jaw tightened. Tonight? Possibly. The uncertainty proved deeply unsettling. For the first hour, however, the evening proceeded smoothly. Donations exceeded expectations. Speeches were delivered. Auctions raised substantial funds. Charlotte spent much of the event speaking with benefactors and community leaders. Several new funding opportunities emerged. For once, she allowed herself to relax. That decision lasted exactly 43 minutes. The trouble began near the center of the ballroom. At first, Charlotte noticed only scattered whispers. Then conversations began stopping as she approached. Several guests avoided eye contact entirely. Others looked at her with open curiosity. A familiar feeling settled in her stomach. Something was wrong. Margaret appeared beside her moments later. Concern shadowed her face. "Do not react immediately." Charlotte's pulse quickened. "To what?" Margaret handed her a folded paper. "This appeared in several drawing rooms this afternoon." Charlotte unfolded the document. Her blood turned cold. It was a copy of a personal letter. Or rather, what appeared to be a personal letter. The handwriting resembled hers. The signature resembled hers. The contents, however, were completely fabricated. The letter described an elaborate plan to attract Alexander's attention. It portrayed Charlotte as calculating, ambitious, manipulative. Every vicious rumor from the past several months had been transformed into written evidence. Charlotte read the page twice. Then a third time. Disbelief gradually gave way to understanding. Someone had forged it. Deliberately. Carefully. Cruelly. How many people have seen this? She asked quietly. Margaret's silence answered the question. Too many. Across the ballroom, conversations continued spreading. Guests exchanged copies. Some appeared skeptical. Others looked convinced. Human beings often preferred evidence, even false evidence, over uncertainty. Charlotte folded the paper carefully. Her hands remained steady. Only years of practice made that possible. Charlotte. Margaret's voice trembled slightly. We should leave. Leave. The word struck her unexpectedly hard. 5 years ago, she had left. 5 years ago, she had hidden. 5 years ago, she had allowed other people to define the story. The memory rose with startling clarity. The altar. The whispers. The pity. The endless retreat afterward. No. Not again. Charlotte lifted her head. No. Margaret blinked. What? I am not leaving. The older woman stared at her. Then slowly smiled. Good. Unfortunately, society rarely rewarded courage immediately. As Charlotte moved through the ballroom, she felt the full weight of public judgment settling around her. Conversations lowered when she approached. Guests glanced away. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked entertained. The familiar humiliation returned. Not as sharp as before. Not as devastating. Yet unmistakably present. Across the room, Lady Caroline Graves stood surrounded by admirers. Concern filled her expression with almost theatrical perfection. The poor thing, she murmured to a nearby guest. I hardly know what to believe. Alexander heard every word. Cold fury surged through him. He had spent weeks gathering evidence. Weeks uncovering pieces of the truth. Yet seeing the consequences firsthand transformed irritation into something far more dangerous. Charlotte stood alone near the edge of the ballroom. Hundreds of people surrounded her. Yet she had never looked more isolated. The sight hit him with unexpected force. 5 years ago, nobody had stood beside her. 5 years ago, everyone had watched. Tonight, history appeared determined to repeat itself. Alexander felt something inside him break. Not dramatically. Not violently. Quietly. Completely. He crossed the ballroom. Guests stepped aside automatically. Conversations faltered. The crowd sensed something changing. Charlotte noticed him approaching. Her heart stumbled painfully. Not now. Please not now. She could not endure another public spectacle. Alexander stopped directly before her. Neither spoke. Around them, the room gradually fell silent. Every eye turned toward the Duke of Ravenshire and the woman standing alone beside the ballroom wall. Charlotte understood the danger instantly. Whatever happened next would be remembered. Alexander looked at her. Not the rumors. Not the forged letter. Her. The woman who built schools. The woman who funded clinics. The woman who transformed heartbreak into kindness. Then he turned toward the crowd. His voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom. Calm. Clear. Unmistakable. I have spent the past several months learning an important lesson. Complete silence followed. Hundreds of guests listened. Alexander continued. I learned that gossip often reveals more about the speaker than the subject. A few faces flushed immediately. I learned that rumors survive because good people remain silent. Charlotte's breath caught. The room remained frozen. Most importantly, Alexander said, I learned that Miss Charlotte Bennet possesses more integrity than nearly anyone in this room. Shock rippled through the crowd. Caroline's expression cracked for the first time all season. Alexander was not finished. I know this because I have witnessed her work. His gaze moved across the ballroom. I have seen her support schools. I have seen her support clinics. I have seen her improve lives without seeking recognition. The silence deepened. Charlotte could barely breathe. Any document suggesting otherwise is false. The words landed like thunder. Across the room, several guests exchanged startled glances. Others looked toward Caroline. Alexander's voice hardened slightly. I would advise anyone repeating such lies to reconsider their sources carefully. The warning required no further explanation. For one extraordinary moment, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then Lord Pembroke stepped forward. I can confirm every word. Another voice joined. Then another. Teachers. Benefactors. Community leaders. People Charlotte had helped for years. One after another. The support spread through the room like a rising tide. Not rehearsed. Not coordinated. Genuine. Charlotte stared in disbelief. For so long she had assumed nobody noticed. Nobody remembered. Nobody cared. She had been wrong. Margaret wiped tears discreetly. Nathaniel smiled openly. Across the ballroom, Caroline stood perfectly still. The carefully constructed narrative she had spent months building was beginning to collapse. Yet Charlotte barely noticed. Her attention remained fixed on Alexander. Because throughout everything he had said, he had never looked away from her. And for the first time since the worst day of her life, she no longer felt alone in a crowded room. The ballroom remained silent for several heartbeats after the last voice spoke. It was the kind of silence that arrived only when a room full of people suddenly realized they had been standing on the wrong side of a story. Charlotte could feel it happening around her. The shift. The discomfort. The dawning recognition that many of the individuals who had spent months repeating rumors were now confronted with something far less convenient than gossip. Truth. Alexander remained beside her. Not in front of her. Not speaking for her. Simply beside her. The distinction mattered more than he realized. For years, people had either judged Charlotte or pitied her. Very few had treated her as an equal. The orchestra had stopped playing entirely. Guests stood frozen beneath the chandeliers. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked thoughtful. A few appeared genuinely ashamed. Lord Pembroke stepped forward first. I have worked alongside Miss Bennet for nearly 4 years. His voice carried clearly across the room. Every school currently operating under our education initiative exists partly because of her efforts. Another gentleman nodded. The Westminster Clinic would have closed twice without her support. A woman near the front added quietly, my daughter learned to read because of one of Miss Bennet's programs. More voices followed. Not all at once. One after another. Teachers. Volunteers. Donors. Families. Real people with real stories. The room began filling with evidence no forged letter could compete against. Charlotte listened in stunned silence. She had never sought recognition. She had never expected gratitude. Yet hearing those voices affected her more deeply than she could have imagined. Because they reminded her of something she had forgotten. Her life was larger than her heartbreak. Larger than her humiliation. Larger than society's version of her. Across the ballroom, Lady Caroline Graves finally moved. Her smile remained intact. Barely. How touching. The words floated through the room with practiced elegance. Several guests immediately looked uncomfortable. Caroline continued. No one questions Miss Bennet's charitable efforts. Alexander turned toward her. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Caroline pressed forward anyway. The issue is simply whether those efforts excuse other behavior. Silence followed. Dangerous silence. Charlotte understood exactly what Caroline was attempting. One final attack. One final effort to preserve the narrative. What behavior? Alexander asked quietly. Caroline hesitated. The question had arrived too quickly. Too directly. The letter. The forged letter. Alexander's voice remained calm. Allegedly forged. Nathaniel Mercer stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. Not allegedly. Every eye turned toward him. Nathaniel produced several folded documents. Verified. Caroline's expression finally faltered. I beg your pardon. The handwriting was examined. Nathaniel unfolded one paper. Multiple witnesses have already confirmed the letter was fabricated. Murmurs swept through the ballroom. Caroline's composure slipped another fraction. That proves nothing. Actually, Nathaniel said pleasantly, it proves quite a lot. He handed several papers to Lord Hartwell. The host reviewed them quickly. His expression darkened. Good heavens. The room grew louder. Whispers spread rapidly. Charlotte stared at the unfolding scene in disbelief. Alexander, meanwhile, never took his eyes off Caroline. You have spent months encouraging lies. Caroline laughed lightly. Surely you are not accusing me. I am. The single word landed with astonishing force. No raised voice. No dramatic display. Just certainty. Caroline looked around the room. Searching for support. Finding very little. This is absurd. Is it? Nathaniel offered another document. Several servants disagree. More whispers followed. A few guests began quietly distancing themselves from Caroline's circle. The movement was subtle, yet impossible to miss. Society could be cruel. It could also be remarkably quick to abandon a sinking ship. For the first time all evening, genuine fear appeared in Caroline's eyes. Charlotte felt no satisfaction. Only sadness. This entire disaster had begun because one woman wanted a title badly enough to destroy another person's reputation. It felt tragically small. Alexander stepped forward. Miss Bennet deserved better. The room fell silent again. He continued. She deserved better 5 years ago. Charlotte's breath caught. She deserved better when rumors began spreading. His gaze moved through the crowd. And she deserved better from every person who chose gossip over truth. No one interrupted. No one could. Because he was right. Charlotte felt emotion rising unexpectedly in her chest. Not pride. Not triumph. Something deeper. Validation. The thing she had stopped expecting years earlier. Across the room, Margaret Whitmore quietly wiped away tears. Charlotte noticed. So did Alexander. Their eyes met briefly. 1,000 unspoken things passed between them. Then Lord Hartwell cleared his throat. I believe this matter has been settled. Several guests immediately agreed. Others nodded. The forged letter was quietly collected. Conversations shifted. The scandal that had seemed unstoppable only an hour earlier was already collapsing beneath the weight of evidence. Yet for Charlotte, the most important moment had nothing to do with Caroline. Or the rumors. Or the forged letter. It happened when the crowd gradually dispersed and she found herself standing alone with Alexander near one of the ballroom windows. For a few seconds neither spoke. The city glowed beyond the glass. Carriage lamps moved through the streets below. Music slowly resumed in the background. Life continuing. At last. You should not have done that. Alexander smiled faintly. That sounds familiar. Charlotte looked down. You risked your reputation. No. His answer came immediately. I protected it. She frowned slightly. How? Alexander's expression softened. By finally behaving like the man I should have been from the beginning. The honesty of the statement left her speechless. For several moments she simply looked at him. Really looked at him. Not the Duke. Not the title. Not the powerful figure society admired. The man. The man who had been wrong. The man who admitted it. The man who had spent months trying to become better. Alexander. It was the first time she had spoken his name aloud. The sound of it seemed to surprise them both. He looked at her as though the entire ballroom had disappeared. Yes? Charlotte hesitated. Every instinct urged caution. 5 years of caution. 5 years of carefully protected distance. Yet another voice whispered beneath the fear. A quieter voice. One she had ignored for months. Trust him. The realization frightened her more than anything else. Because she wanted to. Alexander seemed to sense the conflict. His expression remained gentle. Patient. He took a slow breath. I owe you an apology. Charlotte laughed softly. You have already apologized. Not for everything. The answer caught her attention immediately. What do you mean? Alexander looked away briefly. Toward the ballroom. Toward the crowd. Toward the place where this entire story had begun. The night at Lady Ashcombe's ball. His voice lowered. I have regretted those words every day since. Charlotte became very still. Alexander continued. Not because they embarrassed me later. His gaze returned to hers. Because they hurt you. The confession struck harder than she expected. For so long she had assumed he could never truly understand. Yet standing there, listening to him, she realized he did. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough. Enough to care. Enough to change. Enough to fight for her when it mattered. A slow silence settled between them. Comfortable. Honest. Real. Then the orchestra began another waltz. Couples moved toward the dance floor. The ballroom gradually returned to normal. Yet nothing felt normal anymore. Alexander glanced toward the musicians. Then back to Charlotte. A question appeared in his eyes. This time he did not ask it aloud. He did not extend his hand. He did not pressure her. He simply waited. Giving her the choice. Entirely her choice. Charlotte understood immediately. Months ago she would have walked away. Weeks ago she might have hesitated. Tonight, however, something fundamental had changed. Not in him. In her. For the first time since Edward Langley shattered her trust, she found herself wondering whether fear deserved quite so much power over her future. The thought was terrifying. And strangely hopeful. Charlotte looked toward the dance floor. Then back at Alexander. A small smile appeared. Real. Warm. Uncertain. Yet undeniably present. Alexander's heart nearly stopped. Because for the first time, Charlotte Bennet no longer looked at him like a man she was learning to forgive. She looked at him like a possibility. And suddenly the future felt closer than either of them had ever dared imagine. 2 weeks later, London was still discussing the gala. For once, however, the conversation no longer centered on scandal. It centered on consequences. The forged letter had been exposed. The rumors had collapsed. Lady Caroline Graves had quietly withdrawn from several social engagements while her family attempted to repair the damage. Society, as always, adapted quickly. It preferred certainty. Once the tide turned, most people hurried to stand on the winning side. Charlotte found the entire process mildly exhausting. You are becoming famous for all the wrong reasons. Margaret Whitmore set down her teacup with a sigh. Charlotte smiled from across the breakfast table. Again? This time at least people are praising you. That is simply gossip wearing a prettier dress. Margaret laughed. Perhaps. But you deserve some of it. Charlotte looked out the window toward the garden. Roses had begun blooming across the estate. Spring sunlight filled the morning with warmth and color. For the first time in years, the future felt uncertain in a way that did not frighten her. That uncertainty had a name. Alexander Sterling. Since the gala, he had not rushed her. Had not pressured her. Had not attempted to force intimacy through grand gestures. Instead, he appeared. Consistently. Thoughtfully. He attended meetings regarding the Reading Society. Increased funding for educational programs. Visited the clinic. Spoke with volunteers. Listened more than he talked. The effort was impossible to ignore. More importantly, it felt genuine. One afternoon, Charlotte arrived at the Reading Society to find several children gathered around a newly installed bookshelf. Their excitement filled the room. "Miss Bennet!" Emily rushed toward her. "Look!" Charlotte followed the girl's pointing finger. The shelf contained hundreds of new books. Carefully selected. Beautifully bound. Every age group represented. Good heavens! Emily grinned. The Duke sent them. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. Of course he had. Later that evening, she found a note tucked inside one of the volumes. The handwriting was immediately familiar. No speeches. No declarations. Only a single sentence. Every child deserves a chance to dream. Charlotte stared at the words for a long time. Then she smiled. Across London, Alexander spent the same evening in his study attempting and failing to concentrate on estate business. Nathaniel Mercer watched with growing amusement. "You are impossible." Alexander looked up. "Why?" "Because you are behaving like a man deeply in love while simultaneously pretending strategy remains involved." Alexander returned his attention to the papers. "There is strategy involved." "No." Nathaniel shook his head. "There is hope involved." Silence followed. Then Alexander surprised himself by smiling. "Perhaps." Nathaniel leaned back comfortably. "Then what are you waiting for?" Alexander already knew the answer. Charlotte. The decision belonged to her. It always had. 3 days later, Lady Whitmore hosted a spring garden party. Unlike the grand formal events of the season, the gathering felt intimate. Friends. Family. People who genuinely cared for one another. Flowering trees lined the pathways. Musicians played softly beneath white canopies. Children ran through the gardens chasing sunlight and laughter. Charlotte arrived shortly after noon. The moment she stepped through the gates, she sensed something unusual. Smiles appeared everywhere. Suspicious smiles. Margaret's smile proved particularly alarming. "What have you done?" Charlotte asked immediately. "Nothing." "That is never true." Margaret's innocence remained entirely unconvincing. Yet before further interrogation became possible, several guests claimed Charlotte's attention. Conversations followed. Introductions. Greetings. Small moments. The afternoon passed pleasantly. Then Margaret approached once more. "There is someone waiting in the rose garden." Charlotte narrowed her eyes. "Margaret." "Go." The older woman pointed toward a stone pathway. "Trust me." Charlotte should have refused. Instead, she followed the path. The rose garden occupied a quieter section of the estate. Flowering arches created shaded walkways. Benches sat beneath climbing blossoms. The scent of roses drifted through the warm spring air. And waiting beside the central fountain stood Alexander. He turned as she approached. For a moment neither spoke. The garden seemed remarkably still. "I suspected this was a trap." Alexander smiled. "Lady Whitmore." "Obviously." "I agree." Charlotte laughed softly. The sound eased some invisible tension between them. Yet she quickly noticed something different. Alexander appeared nervous. Truly nervous. The realization stunned her. "Alexander." He took a slow breath. "Charlotte." Her pulse quickened unexpectedly. Then he reached into his coat pocket. Charlotte's heart nearly stopped. "Before I say anything," Alexander began quietly, "there is something you should know." She could barely breathe. "What?" He looked directly into her eyes. "If your answer is no, nothing changes." Charlotte stared at him. "What?" "The schools continue receiving support." His voice remained steady despite obvious emotion. "The clinic continues receiving support. The Reading Society continues receiving support." He paused. "You lose nothing." The kindness of the statement nearly broke her heart. Because he meant it. Every word. Alexander stepped closer. Not enough to crowd her. Just enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes. Months ago, I believed status determined value. His expression softened. Then I met you. Charlotte felt tears threatening unexpectedly. Alexander. He shook his head slightly. You taught me that character matters more than rank. Kindness matters more than reputation. Purpose matters more than pride. The garden seemed to disappear around them. You taught me what real strength looks like. Charlotte could not look away. He continued quietly. The first time I saw you, I judged you without understanding you. Pain flickered across his face. It remains the greatest mistake of my life. The honesty of the confession left her speechless. Alexander reached into his pocket again. This time he withdrew a small velvet box. Charlotte's breath caught. I cannot undo that mistake. His voice lowered. But I can spend the rest of my life proving I learned from it. Then he opened the box. Sunlight flashed against a diamond ring. The world stopped. Charlotte Bennett. Emotion thickened his voice. Will you marry me? Silence filled the garden. Not awkward silence. Not uncertain silence. The kind that arrives when a life changes forever. Charlotte looked at the ring. Then at Alexander. Then back at the ring again. 5 years earlier, she would have focused on fear. On risk. On the possibility of loss. But standing there, she saw something different. Not perfection. Not guarantees. A man who had been wrong and changed. A man who chose humility over pride. A man who had stood beside her when it mattered most. She realized something then. Trust was not built through grand promises. It was built through consistent actions. Through kindness. Through showing up again and again until fear no longer held the loudest voice. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She laughed softly through them. You know. Alexander's expression tightened with nervous anticipation. What? Charlotte smiled. This is a considerably better invitation than the dance. For one horrifying second, Alexander looked uncertain. Then she held out her hand. Yes. The single word changed everything. Relief crashed across his face so visibly that Charlotte laughed again. He slid the ring onto her finger. Perfect fit. Perfect moment. Perfect because it was real. Not because it was flawless. Alexander lifted her hand carefully. You have made me the happiest man in England. That seems statistically difficult to verify. His laugh echoed through the garden. Warm. Free. Joyful. For the first time since she had known him, there was no restraint left in it. Moments later, applause erupted from behind the rose hedges. Charlotte jumped. Margaret Whitmore emerged first. Nathaniel Mercer followed. Then half the garden. Margaret. Charlotte stared in disbelief. You hid people in the roses. Only temporarily. Margaret looked delighted. It was worth it. Laughter filled the garden. Congratulations followed. Happiness spread through the gathering with remarkable speed. Yet amid all the celebration, one moment remained most important. Later, as evening sunlight turned the roses gold, Charlotte and Alexander stood together beside the fountain. Quietly. Peacefully. The crowd had drifted elsewhere. The excitement had softened. For a while they simply watched the sunset. Do you regret anything? Alexander asked. Charlotte considered the question carefully. 5 years of pain. 5 years of rebuilding. 5 years of learning who she truly was. Finally she smiled. No. Alexander looked surprised. Nothing? She glanced at the ring on her finger. Then at the man beside her. Every difficult thing led me here. Emotion flickered in his eyes. Charlotte slipped her hand into his. comfortable, natural, home. Across London, people would continue talking. Society would always talk. But for the first time in years, Charlotte Bennet no longer cared. Because she was no longer the woman people whispered about in ballrooms. She was no longer the abandoned bride. No longer the cautionary tale. She was the woman who had walked away with her dignity intact. The woman who built something meaningful from heartbreak. The woman who discovered that her worth had never depended upon anyone else's opinion. And in the end, the Duke who once failed to see her value learned the same lesson. Not because society told him. Not because circumstance forced him. Because she showed him. Together, they walked back toward the house as twilight settled across the gardens. Ahead waited family, laughter, purpose, and a future neither would face alone. Behind them, the roses swayed gently in the evening breeze. And for the first time, every chapter of Charlotte's story finally belonged to her.